In 1865, a French surgeon named Paul Broca received a package from the Dordogne region in southwestern France. Inside was a skull. Not unusual on its face, Broca was an anatomist. He received skulls. But this one was different, and when he turned it over in his hands, he stopped. There was a hole in it. Not a fracture, not the ragged entry wound of a weapon. A clean hole, roughly circular, about 3 centimeters across, cut through the bone with unmistakable precision. The edges were smooth, beveled, and around the rim of the hole, the bone had begun to regrow. Whoever this was, they had survived. Broca's hands were shaking slightly, by some accounts, though given that he was a 19th century Frenchman writing about his own brain research, we should take the drama with appropriate salt. But his conclusion was solid, and it changed everything. This skull was approximately 7,000 years old. Someone, 7 millennia before the invention of antibiotics, before the germ theory of disease, before any formal medical school had ever opened its doors, had deliberately cut a hole in another person's skull. And that person had lived, had healed, had walked around afterward with a neat circle of missing bone in their head, bone cells slowly bridging the gap, and presumably told no one exactly what had happened to them. That skull is the first chapter of this story, not the Hippocratic Oath, not the Edwin Smith Papyrus, not Galen or Vesalius or Pasteur. A hole in a skull, cut by an unnamed hand, in a world so ancient it barely registers as history at all. This is the story of medicine before doctors, before the profession, before the theory, before the word. It begins, as all the best things do, in the dark. We tend to think of medicine as something humans invented, a set of ideas formalized at some identifiable moment in history, maybe in Greece, maybe in Egypt, depending on which textbook you were handed at school. A moment when someone sat down, thought carefully, and decided that illness had causes, and causes had cures. But that's not how it started. It started the same way almost everything started, with pain. Watch a dog lick a wound. Watch a chimpanzee seek out specific leaves to self-medicate intestinal parasites, something primatologist Michael Huffman documented in the 1980s, observing chimps in the Mahale Mountains of Tanzania selecting the bitter pith of Vernonia amygdalina specifically when they were sick, a plant that contains steroidal compounds active against parasites. Watch an elephant travel kilometers out of her way to eat a particular soil clay that reduces stomach acidity. The impulse to treat injury and illness is not uniquely human. It is ancient, in a way that predates our species entirely. What is uniquely human, or at least nearly so, is the transmission of that knowledge. The decision to not just act on instinct, but to remember, to teach, to build. The oldest compelling evidence of deliberate medical care in the human record sits in a cave in Iraq. Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains, excavated in the late 1950s by archaeologist Ralph Selecki. Among the bones he found there, Neanderthal bones 60,000 years old, was one particularly interesting burial. The soil around the skeleton contained a remarkable concentration of pollen from flowers, specifically yarrow, groundsel, grape hyacinth, joint pine, hollyhock. Flowers that don't grow in caves, flowers that had been placed there, in a pattern, around a body. Flowers, and here's the part that caught the world's attention, that are medicinal. Yarrow has been used as an astringent and anti-inflammatory in folk medicine across dozens of cultures. Groundsel has analgesic properties. Joint pine, the plant genus Ephedra, contains ephedrine, a compound still used today. Now, a word of caution. The Shanidar flower burial has been contested for decades. Some paleoanthropologists argue the pollen concentration might have been caused by a burrowing rodent, a flower-carrying gerbil effectively, or by contamination from later human activity in the same cave. The debate is ongoing. But here's what's not contested: the individual in that burial. Shanidar 1, as he's cataloged, an adult male Neanderthal, estimated to have lived to his early 40s in a time when reaching 30 was an achievement, had survived extraordinary injury before his death. His right arm was withered and had likely been amputated above the elbow during his lifetime. He had healed fractures across his skull and face. He had severe arthritis. He was almost certainly blind in one eye. He had survived, for years, maybe decades. In an environment where survival depended on physical capability, this man, who could not have hunted effectively, who may have been unable to contribute to basic camp tasks, had been kept alive by his community, fed, protected, cared for. You can call that evidence of healing behavior, or you can call it evidence of empathy. In medicine, for most of human history, those two things were the same. Fire changes everything. We sometimes list fire as a technological achievement, which it is. We sometimes list it as a culinary revolution, which it also is. Cooking food dramatically increases caloric availability and is one of the likely drivers of the brain expansion that makes us, us. But fire is also medical technology. Fire sterilizes. Not because early humans understood the germ theory of disease, they had no such concept, but because they discovered empirically that wounds treated with heated tools or covered with ash healed better than wounds left alone. That water boiled over flame made people less sick than water drunk straight from a river. That warmth accelerated recovery from injury. The Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 3000 BCE, is where the archaeological record of medicine becomes more specific, more readable. We're past purely inferential territory now. Burial sites across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia contain skeletal evidence of healed fractures set with apparent splinting, skulls with teeth cleanly extracted, the bone healed afterward, infected teeth with deliberate drilled access holes, dental care in recognizable form 9,000 years ago. A 6,500-year-old jawbone found in Slovenia in the 1980s, examined with modern analytical techniques, revealed a tooth cavity treated with beeswax, still present, still adhered to the cavity walls after 65 centuries. These weren't accidents. These were interventions. Someone looked at pain, recognized it as a problem with a potential solution, and acted. That is medicine, in its first, purest form. The recognition that suffering can sometimes be addressed. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you lived in a world before written language, before organized religion as we now recognize it, before cities or states or any of the institutional structures that define modern life, and someone in your community fell badly ill, what would you do? You would do what humans have always done in the face of the genuinely unknown. You would reach for meaning. The first medical professionals were not physiologists, they were meaning makers. We call them shamans, a word borrowed from the Tungusic language of Siberia, shaman, referring to a specific type of spiritual intermediary. The term has been applied so broadly to so many different cultures across history that it risks losing precision entirely. What we're really pointing at is a role, the person in a community who mediates between the visible world of the living and the invisible world of spirits, ancestors, and forces beyond ordinary perception. This person also, typically, healed the sick. For a long time, the standard narrative of medical history treated shamanism as a superstitious predecessor to real medicine, the embarrassing childhood of a field that eventually grew up into science. We know better now, or we should. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote one of the most quietly revolutionary papers in the study of healing in 1949. It was called The Effectiveness of Symbols, and its central argument was both simple and unsettling. Ritual healing works. Not in the mystical sense, not because spirits intervene, but because the human body is not a machine that processes biological inputs in isolation. It is a system profoundly entangled with belief, meaning, social context, and expectation. The shaman's performance of healing, the chanting, the herbs, the drama, the social witness of the community gathered around the sick person, activates real physiological responses. Endorphin release, reduced stress hormones, immune modulation. This is not metaphor. It is measurable, documented, peer-reviewed biology. The placebo effect, which we will examine in detail in a later episode, is the modern medical system's somewhat uncomfortable acknowledgement of this truth. A sugar pill can lower blood pressure. A fake surgery can reduce knee pain as effectively as a real one, in clinical trials published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The act of being treated, of being seen as ill and attended to, of being embedded in a ritual of care. These things have biological consequences independent of the specific chemical or mechanical intervention involved. The shaman knew this, not theoretically, practically, empirically, over generations of observation. What the shaman also knew was pharmacology. Every shamanistic healing tradition across every documented culture on Earth involves plants. The overlap between the ethnobotanical knowledge of traditional healers and the active compounds identified by modern pharmacology is not small. It is extensive. Willow bark, used across dozens of independent cultures from Europe to the Americas to East Asia as a fever reducer and pain reliever, contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, which is the active compound in aspirin. The foxglove plant, Digitalis purpurea, used in Welsh folk medicine for centuries to treat what healers called dropsy, the swelling associated with heart failure. Digitalis glycosides extracted from foxglove are still the basis of digoxin, one of the most commonly prescribed cardiac medications on the planet. Artemisia annua, sweet wormwood, used in Chinese traditional medicine for over 2,000 years for intermittent fevers. The artemisinin extracted from it is now the frontline treatment for malaria. Tu Youyou won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2015 for this discovery, a discovery that started with a 4th century BCE Chinese text. The point is not that traditional medicine was the same as modern medicine. It wasn't. The theoretical frameworks were entirely different. The mechanisms were, almost universally, wrong. Disease attributed to spiritual imbalance, broken taboos, the malicious intent of enemies, supernatural forces. The point is that the empirical database, the accumulated observation of generations of healers watching what happened when they gave people certain plants, or performed certain procedures, or conducted certain rituals, was sophisticated, detailed, and in many cases, correct. The mechanism was wrong. The outcome was sometimes right. And in medicine, as in much of life, outcomes are what people remember. In 1991, 2 hikers in the Alps on the border of Austria and Italy found a body. They thought it was a recent death, a climbing accident maybe. They were wrong by about 5,300 years. Ötzi the Iceman, as he came to be known, is one of the most studied individuals in the history of science. The cold had preserved him with extraordinary completeness: skin, organs, stomach contents, clothing, and, critically for our purposes, equipment. In a small pouch attached to his gear, researchers found 2 pieces of a bracket fungus, Piptoporus betulinus, birch polypore, threaded onto leather strips. This fungus contains agaric acid, which has antibiotic properties against the type of intestinal parasites found in Ötzi's gut at autopsy. It also contains compounds active against mycobacteria. He was, in all probability, using it medicinally. He was also carrying Pteridium aquilinum, bracken fern, in his colon. Bracken has antiparasitic properties. He was, at the time of his death, apparently treating himself for an intestinal infection. Ötzi's medicine kit is the oldest we've ever found, but it's not an anomaly. It's a data point in a pattern that appears, with remarkable consistency, across nearly every prehistoric and early historic culture we've ever studied. Humans were pharmacologists before they were anything else medical. The question of how they figured it out is genuinely fascinating, and there are 2 competing theories. The first is the trial and error model. Humans, foraging widely and under frequent pressure of illness and injury, experimented, sometimes catastrophically, with plants in their environment and remembered what worked and what killed you. This is plausible. It is slow. It does not require any sophisticated conceptual framework, just accumulated observation over generations. The second theory is more interesting and more contested. The ethnobotanist Gordon Wasson, the anthropologist Jeremy Narby, and more recently the scholar Andrew Weil have each argued, in different ways with different levels of scholarly rigor, that altered states of consciousness played a central role in early pharmacological discovery. The argument goes like this: certain plants that humans discovered and use medically are not obvious candidates for experimentation. They are not common food plants. They are sometimes toxic in all but very specific preparations. Their medical use is not straightforwardly derivable from observation of animal behavior, but they are, in many cases, psychoactive. And in shamanic healing traditions around the world, the discovery of medicinal plants is often attributed, mythologically, to visions received in altered states, to the plants themselves telling the healer their uses. This sounds mystical. It may not be entirely so. There is documented evidence that psychedelic states can produce extremely detailed sensory and conceptual associations between plants, chemicals, and bodily states, what some researchers call synesthetic pharmacognosy. It is not impossible that the ritual use of psychoactive plants created a feedback loop in which altered perception enhanced pattern recognition in plant medicine associations. We don't need to fully accept this theory to find it useful. What it points to is the same thing the whole of prehistoric medicine points to, that healing, in its original form, was not separate from the full spectrum of human experience: spiritual, psychological, social, physical. It was all of these things at once. The Neolithic pharmacist was also the community's priest, psychologist, and emergency surgeon. Which brings us to the procedure that makes every medical historian simultaneously impressed and slightly nauseated. Take a moment to fully register what we are about to discuss. Before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before any understanding of infection, nerve function, or intracranial pressure, in a world where the medical understanding of the brain was essentially zero, people drilled holes in other people's skulls, and those people survived. Trepanation, from the Greek trepanon, meaning borer, is the oldest surgical procedure in the human record with sufficient evidence to be unambiguous. It appears on every inhabited continent except Antarctica. The oldest confirmed cases are from the Neolithic period, roughly 6,500 to 7,000 years ago. The procedure continued in various forms into the medieval period and beyond, and in some traditional cultures was still being performed in the 20th century. The distribution is what breaks your brain, if you'll forgive the expression. Trepanned skulls have been found in Neolithic France, in pre-Columbian Peru and Bolivia, in ancient China, in Bronze Age Europe, in Neolithic Russia, in pre-contact North America. In some burial sites, particularly the Neolithic cemetery at Insisheim in France, the percentage of trepanned skulls among adults reaches 12%. Nearly 1 in 8 people in that community had the procedure. These are not isolated accidents. This was practiced medicine. The techniques varied by region and period. Scraping, using a sharp flint tool to grind progressively deeper into the skull until breakthrough. Boring, using a drill-like implement to make a series of small perforations around a circle, then lifting out the disc of bone. Cutting, using a fine blade to score straight lines in a square or rectangular pattern, then prying out the piece. Sawing. Each method leaves a characteristic signature in the bone that allows modern forensic anthropologists to identify the technique from thousands of years later. And what those forensic anthropologists find, consistently, is evidence of survival. In a 2018 study published in World Neurosurgery examining a large sample of trepanned skulls from Neolithic Europe and the Americas, researchers found that the majority showed signs of bone regrowth around the wound margins, unambiguous evidence that the patient had lived after the procedure. Some skulls showed multiple trepanations, with earlier holes fully healed and new ones at different locations. One Peruvian skull, from roughly 1000 CE, had 5 separate trepanations in various stages of healing. The survival rate, assessed across multiple studies, is estimated at roughly 60 to 80% in some populations, which is, to put it plainly, extraordinary for cranial surgery performed with stone tools. Why did they do it? This is the question that has occupied researchers for 150 years, and the honest answer is, we don't entirely know, and the answer almost certainly varied across cultures and periods. The most commonly offered explanation, consistent with the theoretical frameworks of prehistoric medicine, is that trepanation was performed to release spirits, demons, or other supernatural entities believed to be causing illness, epilepsy, severe headaches, madness, behavior changes. You drill a hole, the evil escapes, the patient recovers. This is probably part of it, but it may not be all of it. Physical trauma to the skull was common in prehistoric and early historic populations, from warfare, from accidents, from interpersonal violence. Epidural and subdural hematomas, bleeding between the skull and the brain, causing rapidly increasing intracranial pressure, are survivable if drained. They are fatal if not. An untreated epidural hematoma produces a characteristic clinical progression: initial loss of consciousness, a lucid interval of apparent recovery, then rapid neurological deterioration and death. A healer who had observed this pattern enough times might have discovered, empirically, that drilling into the skull at the site of impact, releasing the pressure, sometimes reversed the decline. They didn't have the words intracranial pressure, they didn't know what a hematoma was, but they knew what they had seen, and they acted on it. There is a skull in the collection of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, one of Broca's finds, or from the same sites he excavated, that has been trepanned multiple times. The earliest hole is entirely healed, the bone fully bridged. The second is partially healed. The third shows minimal regrowth. This person had the procedure 3 times over what appears to be a span of years. They survived the first 2. The third, perhaps, was their last. We know nothing else about them. We don't know their name, their language, their beliefs, what happened in the days and weeks after each operation. We don't know if they were a community elder or a young warrior or an ordinary person who had exceptionally bad luck with head injuries. We know that someone operated on them 3 times, with care, with technique, with a set of skills accumulated over generations, and that twice, at minimum, it worked. Here's a problem with the way we teach medical history. We tend to draw a bright line between prehistoric medicine, the stuff we've been discussing, and the literate civilizations of the ancient world: Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece. As if one day someone invented writing and medicine suddenly began. But the knowledge doesn't reset. It doesn't start over. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts we possess, written in Egypt around 1550 BCE, and almost certainly copying far older oral traditions, contains over 700 medical prescriptions using hundreds of plant compounds. Many of them overlap, in compounds and applications, with what we know of prehistoric herbal medicine from the archaeological record. The knowledge traveled forward. It was written down at last, but it didn't originate with the writing. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the Hindu scriptures, contains references to medical knowledge that predate the formal development of Ayurveda as a system by centuries. The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which forms the basis of traditional Chinese medicine, is attributed to the legendary emperor Huangdi, but draws on accumulated medical knowledge stretching back millennia. What shifts with the literate civilizations is not the existence of medical knowledge. What shifts is its organization, its theoretical codification, and, critically, its social structure. Medicine becomes a profession. This is both a gain and a loss. The gain is real. Codification allows knowledge to be preserved, transmitted, refined, and built upon across generations and across geographical distances. You no longer have to personally apprentice with a healer to access their knowledge. It exists in a text. It can travel. The loss is subtler and worth noting. The earliest healers operated in a context of radical integration. Medicine, ritual, community, psychology, and ecology were a single fabric. The healer was embedded in the life of the people they served. They knew which plants grew where. They knew the psychological histories of their patients. They were present at births and deaths, at crises of meaning and crises of the body. As medicine professionalized, it progressively separated itself from most of these things, which gave it enormous power in certain domains: systematic observation, experimental rigor, pharmacological precision, and left it, increasingly, with no good answers for questions like, why does this person keep getting sick? Or, what does it mean to heal? Or, what is the connection between what a person believes and what their body does? Those questions, the early healers would have found strange, not because they were unanswerable, but because they would never have separated them in the first place. We are, in some ways, still finding our way back. There is a researcher at the University of New Mexico named Andrew Weil, now better known as an integrative medicine advocate than a pure scientist, but that's beside the immediate point, who said something that has stayed with me. He said, The history of medicine is largely the history of the placebo effect. He meant it critically, as a challenge to the profession's tendency to attribute all healing to specific interventions and ignore the role of the therapeutic relationship, of meaning, of expectation. But I think there's something else in it, something more generous. What the history of prehistoric medicine shows us is that humans, well before they had the conceptual tools to understand disease at a mechanistic level, were remarkably effective healers. Not always, not consistently, not by modern standards of evidence, but not by chance either. They were effective because they paid extraordinary attention, because they developed, over millennia, a detailed empirical database of what worked, because they understood intuitively, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say they had never forgotten, that healing is a fundamentally relational act, that a sick person is a whole person, body, mind, history, community, meaning. The hole in the Neolithic skull, the one Broca held in his hands in 1865, the bone regrowing around the edges, is not evidence of a primitive fumbling toward real medicine. It is evidence of a fully realized, culturally embedded, empirically grounded practice of care that was, by any reasonable measure, working. The unnamed person who picked up the stone tool and drilled that hole had been trained by someone, who had been trained by someone, who had been trained by someone, in a chain reaching back into a past so remote we can barely imagine it. They had a theory, probably involving spirits or cosmic forces or the will of gods we no longer name. Their theory was wrong, but their patient walked away. That gap between the wrong theory and the right outcome is, in many ways, the whole story of medicine. It is a story full of wrong theories, full of brilliant mistakes, brilliant accidents, brilliant stubbornness in the face of things that shouldn't work but do. Full of people who looked at pain and decided, against all odds, that it was their problem to solve. The first healer whose name we will never know, whose hands shaped a stone, whose patient healed, made that decision in a world of almost total darkness. They made it anyway. That's where we start.